You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome, everyone, to a webinar entitled Brain and Artificial Intelligence, a Tale of Two Computers, but only one made in the image of God, with presenters Dr. Robert Koons and Dr. Terrence Lagerlund. My name is Sebastian Mahfood, and I'm the director of ITEST. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically, in the wisdom traditions of the human community, and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our first presenter, Deacon David Miskell will offer our opening prayer. Deacon Miskell joins us from Waterloo, Illinois, where he ministers at Saints Peter and Paul Catholic Church in grade school and at two sister parishes. He assists at Gibbo Catholic High School, called upon by his wife, a theology teacher there. He was ordained as a permanent deacon in June 2023 for the Diocese of Belleville, Illinois. He is a father of 6 and works as a field application engineer in the field of electronics. Deacon Miskell, take it away.
Let us begin. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, you are the creator of all, which in your plan is good. We offer our conversation, our studies, our intellects, our wills to your design. We pray that the tool of artificial intelligence be utilized as a gift for humanity, which you created very good. We beg you to guide us in this endeavor. As we begin today's session, let us pray together in the words our Savior gave us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Thank you, Deacon Miskell. And now I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter. Rob Koons, is a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. He holds an MA from Oxford and a PhD from UCLA. He is the author or co-author of 5 books, including The Atlas of Reality with Timothy H. Pickavants and Is Thomas Aquinas' Philosophy of Nature Obsolete? He is the co-editor of 4 anthologies, including The Waning of Materialism and Classical Theism. He has been working recently on an Aristotelian interpretation of quantum theory and on defending and articulating hylomorphism in contemporary terms. Dr. Koons' presentation is entitled AI and Aristotle, Why No Artifact Could Ever Be Conscious. Dr. Koons, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sebastian. Thanks so much for the invitation, chance to participate. I'm going to make only one very simple point. Let me see if I can share my screen. Trying to remember where that goes. There we go. And there we go. And let's see. I'm not sure if I can see what you're seeing, but let me see if I can start the slideshow. There we go. Is that working for everyone?
Yes.
Great. So for reasons of time, I'm going to try to make just one simple point, but it has pretty profound, I think, implications. Namely that no artifact can be conscious. So there's going to be a slight clash of language, perhaps, between me and Dr. Lagerlund. I'm going to say that the brain is not a computer at all. That because I'm going to use the word computer to mean something that has been made, things have been constructed, and the brain is not an artifact. Therefore, and human beings, of course, are not artifacts. So I'm going to argue that only living organisms like human beings could, and even in principle, be conscious. No artifact can be. So the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle whose work I'm very interested in, developed a comprehensive philosophy of nature that really laid the foundations for all subsequent scientific inquiry. And a central notion of Aristotle's is that of a substance in English or Latin, and a ousia in Greek, which is an essentially independent entity that has the highest degree of unity. Thomas Aquinas calls this per se unity. So living organisms have this kind of unity, which explains how they can possess essentially unified causal powers like nutrition, growth, and crucially, sensation and thought. And now there are also simple homogeneous inorganic substances like drops of water or quartz crystals. However, all human artifacts, including all robots and computers, are mere heaps of inorganic components. So heap is the contrasting term here to substance. It's just a pile of substances. These things lack the sort of unity that's required for life, sensation, and consciousness. So AI programs can emulate the behavior of conscious organisms, but there's an irreducible gap here between the appearance of the emulation on the one hand and the reality of consciousness and sensation on the other hand. Okay, let's see how I can. There we go. So here's a quick overview of the talk. I'm going to say a little bit more about what a substance is. Why do substances matter? Why conscious beings must be substances, and therefore artifacts cannot be substances. Two absurd consequences that follow from the idea that artifacts could be conscious. And then finally conclude with the so-called Turing test and talk a little bit more about appearance versus reality. Okay, there we go. Oops, sorry. So a substance, ousia. To be a substance is to exist in the most central focal sense of the word. That is at least for creatures. To exist, to be a substance is to constitute the uniquely fundamental level of created reality. Everything else depends upon the substances. Substances have per se unity. They're unified in the strongest possible sense. And substances are the ground within nature for all change and persistence. So the ultimate explanation for why things change, why they don't change, has to do with the substances and their natures. Now, why do substances matter? Well, everything that isn't a substance is going to be one of 4 or 5 things. It's either a fragment or remnant of a substance, a mere heap of substances and fragments, an attribute or power of a substance, which we can call an accident, a process of change that's undergone by a substance, or something that's wholly grounded by and reducible to 1 through 4. So as you can see, substances play a really central role in our understanding of nature. Jonathan Schaffer, recent philosopher, has expressed what he called the tiling constraint. If you think of a floor that's been covered with tiles, no 2 tiles overlap, but the floor is completely covered with tiles. And that's the Aristotelian picture of reality, that substances are the tiles. No 2 substances overlap. You can't have a substance within another substance, but all of reality is covered, so to speak, by the totality of substances. They constitute that fundamental level of reality. Now, substances have natures, and natures ground the laws of nature. So every substance has a nature or an essence, which is captured in a real definition, which states what it is to be a substance of that kind. So therefore, all substances belong to what we call natural kinds in philosophy. These are not conventional. These are real joints in nature, so to speak. And all the laws of nature are made true by the natures of the substances. So Coulomb's law, for instance, is made true by the nature of charged particles. So nothing happens in nature, barring a miracle, except by being directed to happen by one or more substances. So substances are the bearers of all the fundamental properties in nature, attributes, accidents, and powers, and so on. Now, what are the world's substances? As I mentioned at the beginning, homogeneous bits of inorganic matter, like crystals, blobs of liquid, bodies of gas, bubbles, and so on, these are substances. I've argued in some of my recent work that fundamental particles like protons, electrons, and photons are not substances, but are rather always fragments or accidents of substances. Now, living organisms, at least from bacteria up, are substances. If they were not, biology would not be a real science. So those who think they aren't substances are really saying that biology is a pseudoscience, that there are, in fact, no real organisms. Now, wholly immaterial substances are possible, like angels and the human soul after death and before resurrection. But that's it. Artifacts and other heaps, when they're not a homogeneous bit of matter, are not substances. So there's one exception of an artifact that could be a substance. If I make an ice crystal If the ice is a homogeneous inorganic substance, then it is indeed a substance and an artifact. But all machines, let's say, all robots and computers are not substances. They're merely heaps of inorganic substances that we have assembled in a certain way. They lack the unity that any organism has. So I'm going to run through a few arguments here to explain why artifacts can't be conscious. I'll start with George Buehler's self-consciousness argument. So in introspection, I'm aware of my own mental states as such. I don't have any such access to my brain states. If my mental state were merely some function of a heap of substances in my brain, then brain states could only be related to other brain states. They couldn't relate to these functional states. So a functionless picture cannot explain how we have reliable introspective knowledge of our own mental states. So move on to the third point, why conscious things must be substances. Based on arguments like Buehler's, I would argue that properties of consciousness, like feeling, thinking, judging, deciding, remembering, all of these properties and activities are metaphysically fundamental or irreducible. And again, for reasons of time, I'm not going to be able to run through these arguments in any detail, but I'll just mention some. I think Sebastian mentioned the book that I edited with George Buehler back in 2010 called The Waning of Materialism. We can run through some of these there. There's a Kripke's argument, Frank Jackson's knowledge argument, David Chalmers' zombie argument, and so on. So again, during discussion, we can go into some of these in more detail. But there are a number of reasons for thinking that consciousness is among the fundamental properties and activities of nature, just as fundamental as things like electric charge or mass or spin and other things that physicists and chemists study. So we're aware of ourselves as the subject of all of our experiences. The philosopher Immanuel Kant put it this way: I can add the I think to all of my inner representations. So if I see a blue bottle, I can always say, I think I see a blue bottle. I think there's a blue bottle there. That I think is what unifies, in a sense, all of our conscious experiences into a single whole. Now, an artifact, a computer, a robot, any electronic system, is merely a heap of fundamental particles with no real unity. And the particles that compose an artifact are in constant flux, coming and going. There's no enduring physical thing to be the persisting subject. And the spatial boundaries of the artifact are vague and merely conventional. So if one's really a serious materialist, you really seriously think that the only artifacts the only substances in the world are small, inorganic, non-living substances, then you should argue that life itself is an illusion, and if life's an illusion, so is consciousness. And there are a number of philosophers who actually do surprisingly argue this. Daniel Dennett and others argue that the very idea that there is consciousness at all in the world is a mere illusion. Of course, this raises the question, who's experiencing the illusion if all consciousness is merely an illusion? So why heaps, including all artifacts, can't think or feel? Now, you might push back against my argument at this point and say, well, wait a minute. Why couldn't thinking, believing, sensing, and so on be performed collectively by particles or other small homogeneous inorganic things? Why, in other words, can't a plurality of particles compose a single thing in some sense that's capable of conscious activity? So suppose that there is some plurality of particles, some zillion particles, so to speak, that is somehow jointly capable of conscious activity. Either the particles themselves jointly participate in some conscious activity, or they somehow compose a thing that can therefore be conscious. Here's a couple of reasons why I think thinking this picture won't work. First of all, there's the problem of the many. So consider any particle X in P. So P is the collection, let's say, of particles that make up my brain. Now consider any particle X that's in P. If those particles are capable jointly of being conscious, then surely P minus X is also conscious. I mean, that one particle, the one electron in some neuron somewhere can't make the difference between the brain being conscious and not being conscious. So therefore, there isn't just one thinker. There's at least two. There's P and there's P minus X. But of course, the same thing applies to every particle in my brain, P minus Y, P minus Z, and so on. So rather than having just one thinker or two thinkers, there's actually trillions, quadrillions, maybe some astronomically large number of thinkers, all roughly coinciding with my brain at any particular point in time. And that's surely crazy. I mean, surely there's just one thinker here, right? There can't be trillions and quadrillions and so on of thinkers simultaneously coexisting within my skull. There's also the problem of persistence. So the particles in P are in close proximity to each other for only a very small fraction of a second. All the particles in my brain are coming and going into the surrounding environment. So therefore, a conscious state could persist for no longer than, let's say, a nanosecond. Now, this would make self-consciousness, short-term memory, inference, and deliberation impossible. So if the particles do somehow jointly participate in thinking, then they're only going to be able to think for an extremely short period of time. And then another set of particles will come along and take over the thinking. But there won't be one thing that has this conscious state for anything longer than a vanishingly small period of time. And therefore, it's impossible for us to remember, to engage in inference, to deliberate. All those things are impossible because there isn't an enduring thing on that kind of picture. This is why computers can't do any of those things, not really. So how is it that living organisms are able to do this? Well, living organisms have a natural and intrinsic nature. This is something that grounds the identity of that organism both at a time, synchronically, and through time, diachronically. So living things have an intrinsic principle of life, a soul, which is responsible for their per se unity, that really strong sense of unity, and their distinctively biological and psychological nature and powers. So there's no problem of the many. Me minus one of my M particles is not a living thing. It's only part of a living thing. And so there's no problem of many. There's only one thinker here, one living organism with one soul. And secondly, my soul persists as my particles come and go. So there's no problem about persistence. I'm able to persist for minutes, hours, days, years, decades even, on the basis of that enduring soul, even though the particles are constantly coming and going. So just to conclude, you might say, well, what about the Turing test, right? I claim that no computer can think. But suppose we built a computer that's so sophisticated that it appears to think. It passes what Alan Turing called, what we now call the Turing test, based on Alan Turing, who was a computer science pioneer in the mid-20th century. Turing proposed this test that if we cannot tell whether we're conversing with an AI program, like Data from Star Trek New Generation, or a human person, then we should treat the AI program as a person. If there's no behavioral distinction, there's no way for us to distinguish operationally, experimentally, but based on those interactions, whether we're talking to a real person or merely AI program, then what's the difference? We should think of the AI program as conscious. So the problem with this is that this Turing test is based on, it's really what I would call the last gasp of a dead philosophical program called logical positivism. Logical positivism was the idea that any statement or thought that we have makes claims that are only claims about what can be verified experimentally, basically in a laboratory. So if you can't tell the difference if you can't verify or falsify a proposition experimentally, then it's meaningless. And if you can't distinguish between two propositions experimentally, then they're the same thing. So if I can't distinguish experimentally between interacting with an AI program and interacting with a person, they're the same thing. They're ontologically equivalent. Well, as I said, this is a dead philosophical program. Nobody believes it anymore. There are many real differences that are not empirically detectable. And this shows up in lots of areas of science. The biggest problem with logical positivism, of course, was that it was self-defeating. If you ask, well, why should I believe logical positivism? The answer would have to be, well, because we can verify it in the laboratory. But you can't verify in the laboratory, right? That any statement that's not experimentally verifiable is meaningless. That's not a scientific claim. That's not a claim that could be experimentally justified. So logical positivism doesn't make sense. The Turing test is merely a consequence of that. We are, in fact, I think it's actually relatively easy to fool us into thinking that we're dealing with a real person. We're inclined to project consciousness on other things. There was a program, very simple program, that was developed in 1964 called ELIZA that emulated the behavior, so to speak, of a Rogersian therapist. So you would type in your comments about your life, and the AI program would spit back some very sort of mostly inane comments about, oh, I think you're saying that you're feeling depressed, and so on. And people would interact with this program, and they were sure they were interacting with a real human person, because we just naturally project consciousness onto the kind of behavior that we see, as long as it successfully emulates our behavior at a fairly superficial level. So I think this is happening at a much more sophisticated level now with ChatGPT and so on, and will continue to happen. That is, AI can emulate human behavior to an amazing degree, but it's still just emulating consciousness. It's not real consciousness. It's creating the appearance of thought, feeling, and so on. It's not the real thing, and we have to resist this tendency to project consciousness on these AI programs. So again, what robots and programs can never do, they can never achieve the metaphysical unity that's required for consciousness. They cannot achieve the living intercourse with the environment that's required for true sentience. They cannot acquire intuitive knowledge of mathematical or ethical principles. They cannot exercise holistic free will. They cannot create beauty or justice with the awareness that they're doing so. And they can create beautiful things, but a program can never be aware of the fact that it's creating something beautiful. That's simply beyond the capacity for any AI program. So here are a few sources that I'm implicitly referring to that you might look at. I mentioned the Koons and Dr book on the waning of materialism. Alexander Proust and I have a paper in the Causal Powers collection in 2017 that explains why functionalism doesn't work, and therefore why, again, artifacts cannot be conscious. I've done some work on the quantum world that's relevant, although I didn't really get a chance to talk about it this morning. And that's the talk. So thank you very much for your patience. Looking forward to our further discussion.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Koons, for your presentation.
You're very welcome.
And now I'm pleased to introduce our second presenter, Dr. Terrence Lagerlund. Dr. Lagerlund has been a neurologist in the Division of Epilepsy at the Mayo Clinic for 35 years, treating patients with epilepsy and interpreting their electroencephalograms. He also lectures to residents and fellows on electroencephalography, including basic principles of electricity and neurophysiology. He has published papers and authored book chapters on electroencephalography and epilepsy, particularly regarding quantitative analysis of electroencephalograms. Prior to becoming a neurologist, he obtained a PhD in physics and worked as a postdoctoral research associate at the MIT Laboratory for Nuclear Science, doing research at Brookhaven National Laboratory in CERN, as a term physicist at Fermilab. Dr. Lagerlund's presentation is entitled Brain, Soul, Artificial Intelligence in Quantum Mystery. Dr. Lagerlund, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Sebastian, for your gracious introduction. And I really enjoyed, Dr. Koons, your presentation and discussion about the classical philosophical idea of substances and what can be concluded from that idea in regard to AI systems and the human mind. I'll be approaching these same topics from the standpoint of science, particularly physics and neurophysiology and mathematics, but I think our conclusions will be rather similar. So let's get started. First, I want to mention a few questions brought about by the whole idea of human consciousness and cognition. Physicist Paul Davies says consciousness is the number one problem of science, of existence even. Conscious experience in humans has always raised philosophical questions such as, what is the basis of human subjective conscious experiences, including self-awareness and the qualia or qualitative features of sensations? And how do humans decide what to do? Do humans really have free will? Or is the human brain like a computer following an algorithm or program that's determined by genetics and modified by experience, making genuine freedom of choice an illusion? To put this more scientifically, how can the deterministic nature of the natural laws governing all physicochemical processes in the brain during thinking and human decision-making be reconciled with true freedom of choice, the ability to understand abstract ideas and to reason abstractly to ascertain truth. So to try to answer some of these questions, I'm going to start by talking about the architecture of the human brain, as well as the architecture of computers. So the fundamental processing units of the brain are called neurons or nerve cells, and there are about 86 billion of these in the cerebral cortex of the human brain, and they come in two major types, the stellate cell and the pyramidal cell. Both of these types of cells have a cell body, or soma. They also have these tree-like branching structures called dendrites that receive messages from other cells. In the stellate cells, the dendrites are kind of arranged all around them like the points of a star, whereas in a pyramidal cell, the dendrites form these long branching structures that extend out over a very large distance compared to the actual size of the cell body, which kind of looks tiny. The dendrites then receive the inputs from many other neurons and they summate them. They put them all together, they integrate them. And then the cells also have an output structure called an axon. The axon is like a wire that carries the message to the next neurons in the network. And they do that through what's called an action potential, an electrical signal traveling down the axon. At the end of the axon, there's usually many, many branches. You can see in this pyramidal cell, there's even some early branches, but at the end of each of these branches, there's other branches. And that's where the actual connection with the next cell in the network is made. So the terminal branches of the axon end up in these structures called synaptic boutons, and they contain these little bubble-like structures called synaptic vesicles, which are filled with molecules of a neurotransmitter or chemical substance. And when an action potential reaches these terminal boutons, it causes these synaptic vesicles to fuse with the cell membrane and dump their contents outside of the cell into what's called the synaptic cleft. They then diffuse across this 15 to 20 nanometer wide synaptic cleft and bind to these structures called receptors that exist in the postsynaptic neuron, specifically in the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. So let's look at these receptors a little more. The receptors are proteins that exist in the cell membrane, and they have binding sites for the neurotransmitter molecules. And they're also associated with some sort of effector mechanism, so that when the neurotransmitter binds, something happens. Very often, that effector mechanism is a channel which goes right through the cell membrane and allows electrically charged ions to pass through. So this particular receptor I'm showing you is called the N-methyl diaspartate receptor, and it has associated with it a calcium channel. This particular receptor is kind of unusual in that it requires two different neurotransmitters, namely glutamate and glycine, to bind simultaneously in order to open the channel and allow the ions to flow. Most receptors require only one neurotransmitter. When these channels open, then, ions such as calcium can enter or leave the cell. So let's talk a little bit more about these ion channels. Ion channels are very important in brain operation, in the operation of the neurons. They're basically proteins that span through the membrane of the cell, and they have these pores or channels which can be either open or closed. And the concentration of ions outside the cell is different from the concentration of ions inside the cell. So when these channels open, the ions tend to flow one way or the other into or out of the cell. The other important thing to note is that this flow of ions constitutes an electric current into or out of the cell. So the ion channels are analogous to transistors, which are devices that control the flow of electrical current in a circuit or control the movement of electric charges. A fun fact is the total number of ion channels in the brain is about 20 quadrillion, which may be compared with the 10 to 150 billion transistors in a modern computer central processing unit or graphic processing unit integrated circuit chip. Another important fact is that the membrane has a voltage difference between the outside of the cell and the inside. At rest, the inside of the neuron is about 60 millivolts more negative than the outside of the cell. But when these channels open and ions pass through, that changes that voltage across the membrane. Also, channels allow the passage of a specific type of ion. They're said to be ion-specific. Some channels allow positive sodium. Other channels allow positive calcium ions to enter the neuron, either way making the inside of the cell less negative. This is called depolarization because it reduces the minus 60 millivolt voltage. And it has an excitatory effect on the neuron. In other words, it makes it more likely that the neuron will fire an action potential. Other channels allow negative chloride ions to enter or positive potassium ions to leave the neuron, either way making the inside of the cell more negative. And that's called hyperpolarization, and it has an inhibitory effect. So that's basically how these neurons' ion channels work. What I'm showing you here is a graph of the membrane voltage in millivolts versus time. And what happens is as these synaptic processes occur and neurotransmitters are released and reach the receptors and open ion channels, that changes the membrane voltage. So if we have something that depolarizes the cell, that's called an excitatory postsynaptic potential, abbreviated EPSP. If we have something that hyperpolarizes the membrane, that's called an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, like this one. So the postsynaptic dendrite summates all these simultaneously occurring EPSPs and IPSPs. And if two EPSPs occur together or two IPSPs occur together, they kind of add to each other. But if an EPSP and an IPSP occur at the same time, they kind of cancel each other out. So the dendrite will fire an action potential called a dendritic spike when the membrane voltage in that dendrite reaches threshold, which is minus 40 millivolts. Now, in turn, the cell body, or soma, which is where all these dendrites kind of feed into that cell body, the cell body summates all these simultaneously occurring dendritic spikes and fires an action potential through the output of the cell, the axon, which then reaches other neurons. And that happens when the membrane voltage on the soma, or body of the neuron, reaches threshold. Now, there's another type of channel other than the channels associated with the neurotransmitter receptors, and these are the voltage-gated channels, and these are the ones that are important for generating both the dendritic spikes and the action potentials in the axon. The sodium channel is activated by depolarizing the membrane to threshold. So when the membrane reaches minus 40 millivolts, this channel pops open and sodium ions flow into the cell. That, of course, will depolarize the cell by making the inside less negative. However, this doesn't last long. The channel is inactivated about 1 millisecond later and closes even if the membrane remains depolarized. So if you plot the sodium current flow versus time, you see it only lasts for a short time, about 1 millisecond. Now, eventually, the channel has to be put back into its original closed deactivated state, and that happens when the membrane repolarizes. And the mechanism for that is another type of channel called the voltage-gated potassium channel. The potassium channels are also closed at resting membrane voltages, but when the membrane voltage reaches threshold of minus 40 millivolts, these channels open, but they open much more slowly than the sodium channels. So the potassium ions, which are more concentrated inside the cell, they flow out when these channels are open, and that tends to repolarize the cell. But that happens after the sodium current. These channels also stay open longer. They eventually will close because the potassium ions repolarize the cell, and once the membrane voltage is no longer at below threshold, these channels close. So these two channels, the sodium and the potassium channels, work together to generate dendritic spikes or action potentials. So You can see here how the membrane voltage at the peak of an action potential goes to plus 30, and then it goes down to below minus 60 temporarily, and then it finally goes back to minus 60. And this occurs repeatedly each time the neuron fires an action potential. Now, I should note that the behavior of these channels is well modeled by a set of 4 ordinary differential equations. This is called the Hodgkin-Huxley model of the action potential, which was first published in 1953. So this is a well-understood mechanism. Now, these neurons don't exist in isolation. They're connected together to form neural networks. And these neural networks can be quite large. For example, the default mode network in the human brain is thought to involve perhaps a billion or several billion neurons, all part of that same network. Other fun facts are that each cortical pyramidal cell receives about 30,000 excitatory synaptic inputs, as well as about 1,500 to 2,000 inhibitory synaptic inputs. Although this network diagram shows mainly forward connections from this layer of neurons to this layer to this layer, in actual fact, there are backward as well as forward connections, and the backward connections are typically inhibitory in nature. So the arrowhead means excitatory, the little circle means inhibitory here. Each pyramidal cell axon in turn makes an average of 7,800 synapses on other neurons. Each synapse, the arrow or circle here, has what's called a synaptic strength, which is defined as the average excitatory or inhibitory postsynaptic potential measured in millivolts that occurs in the postsynaptic neuron due to the firing of the presynaptic neuron. This strength stays relatively constant over time, but it can be altered by a mechanism called long-term potentiation, and this is the mechanism by which the brain learns new behaviors or new facts or experiences. So basically, long-term potentiation, this alteration of the average synaptic strength in all of these connections, is what accounts for learning in the brain. Now let's switch gears and talk about computers. Digital computers are made from what are called Boolean logic gates. These logic gates have 2 inputs called A and B and an output called Q. And because they're digital, they can have only one of 2 states. They either are on or off, represented as the binary number 1 or 0, or as the logic value true or false. So for example, an AND gate has this kind of logic table. It will produce a 1 or true output only if both the A input and the B input is true. On the other hand, an OR gate will produce a 1 or true output if either the A input or the B input or both are true. Another interesting gate is the inhibit gate. This will produce an output which is true only if the A input is true and the B input is false. And there's many other kinds of gates, but basically just a small finite number of these, and all computer circuits, all digitally circuits are made out of these kind of gates. The gates in turns are made out of transistors, these little things, and resistors, these little things, connected to a power supply, like a positive and a negative voltage. So now that we know a little bit about the architecture of the brain and the architecture of a computer, let's ask the question, is the brain a computer? Well, neurons do have computational properties that are akin to the logic gates in a digital computer. That is, a specific set of synaptic inputs at any given time, both the excitatory and inhibitory type, can either cause a neuron to fire an action potential or not, and this does depend on the synaptic strengths. So this is kind of like a Boolean or logic result. It either fires or it doesn't. It's like a true or false, 1 or 0 response. For example, a neuron having an excitatory synapse and an inhibitory synapse with equal synaptic strengths will fire only if the excitatory synapse fires at a time when the inhibitory synapse does not fire. And this is, in fact, a Boolean logic response akin to the behavior of the INH or inhibit or A and not B logic gate in a digital computer. So we can certainly see a lot of analogies between the way neurons work and the way computer logic circuits work. The firing rate, that is the number of action potentials per second, is a measure of the activity of a particular neuron within a neural network. And the firing rate of a sensory neuron encodes the sensory intensity, such as the light intensity striking the retina of the eye. A network of interconnected neurons then computes results from its sensory inputs using this type of representation. The output of the neural network then produces specific behaviors. For example, the last layer in the neural network is connected to your muscles, and the output will cause muscle contraction and thus movements of parts of your body. So learning in the neural network occurs when the synaptic strengths are adjusted to optimize the correspondence between the neuronal network's actual output in response to a specific sensory input and the desired behavioral response. After learning, the network has the ability to generate an intelligent response to the sensory stimuli. Now, this is a very primitive kind of intelligence, this adaptation of behavior via learning. Certainly, it's not what we think of when we think of human intelligence, but it is a sort of intelligence because after learning, the neural network has adapted its behavior in a smart way to the sensory stimuli so as to produce an appropriate behavioral response. Note that consciousness is not required for this kind of primitive intelligence. Even very simple animals like an ant or a worm can learn and have this kind of primitive intelligent response, even if we don't necessarily know that they're conscious. Now let's talk about artificial intelligence systems. Artificial neural networks are made in such a way as to mimic the biological neural networks in a brain. They're composed of interconnected so-called artificial neurons whose computational behavior is designed to be like the behavior of a biological neuron. A signal, which is basically just a real number that's analogous to the neuronal firing rate, is passed from one artificial neuron to the next by artificial synaptic connections that mimic the biological synapses. Each artificial neuron integrates or sums up all the input signals it gets from other artificial neurons, and it computes an output signal according to a predefined formula, which is then passed on to many other artificial neurons. The artificial neuron synaptic strengths are adjusted by training with thousands of example input signals in order to optimize the discrimination of patterns in the inputs and therefore generate an appropriate output. And this allows an intelligent response to each input state. Again, a very primitive kind of intelligence, but intelligent in the sense that it does adapt its behavior to the input signals that it's getting. So this is what an artificial neural network might look like. And in fact, it looks exactly like the neural network that we showed you for the biological neurons. Each artificial synapse, shown here as an arrow, has a synaptic strength. The signal called X from the presynaptic artificial neuron is multiplied by that synaptic strength as the postsynaptic neuron basically adds up or integrates all its synaptic inputs. Note that negative strengths are considered inhibitory, positive, or excitatory. These strengths are then altered by a training procedure in the artificial neural network, or a learning procedure. So this is kind of what's going on here. The artificial neuron is designed to sum up the products of the synaptic signals and the synaptic strengths, and then there's a function which determines its output, which is then passed to other neurons. Note that usually these artificial networks only use forward connections. They don't have the backward connections that we talked about in biological neural networks. So this is how ChatGPT and all these other artificial intelligence systems work. They're basically mimicking what the brain does. This type of artificial neural network is the basis of commercial AI systems. For example, speech recognition is performed by an artificial neural network that's been trained with thousands of examples of actual human speech. The resultant specific actions of the AI system, such as speech output or visual display, is performed based on the recognized words and phrases. For example, I can say to my Google device, "Hey Google, what time is it?"
It's 9:47 a.m.
Yeah, so basically it's artificial neural network recognized after its training the various words and phrases that I said, and it produced a, quote, intelligent response. Note that the behavior of an AI...
because I found these results on search.
Thanks, Google. Note that the behavior of an AI system is entirely determined by its programming and training set, although programming can incorporate randomness so that repeated inquiries may generate different results. But now let's talk about human decision-making, reasoning, and understanding. Free will is defined as the ability to choose one's behavior in a way that is not merely a function of all relevant sensory input, memories, learned experiences, genetics, and any other internal or external determinants. Such freedom would seem to require a non-deterministic process in decision-making. However, all neuronal functions that we just talked about, like integrating synaptic inputs and firing action potentials, are in fact governed by physical laws like the Hodgkin-Huxley differential equations we talked about, which are mathematically deterministic. If brain physiology alone is the cause of human behavior, then human behavior must be as deterministic as the behavior of any digital computer, including those using artificial neural networks. In this case, free will must be an illusion. Okay, well, hold that thought, and now let's talk about another interesting situation. Can human abstract reasoning and understanding be explained on the basis of physical causality? Well, philosopher Edward Feser notes that to understand behavior that results from a choice after reflection about which course of action would be best, it seems insufficient to speak in terms of ordinary causal factors, the stimulation of nerve endings, the secretion of neurotransmitters, the firing of neurons, etc. When the thought that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man brings about the thought that Socrates is mortal, this is a case of logical inference, that is, reasoning abstractly. So how can this possibly be explained by reference to causality? How can the wholly contingent tendency of certain neural processes to trigger certain other ones account for our ability to think in accordance with the utterly inflexible laws of logic? So he poses this question. So to think about that question, could this be done if the brain follows an algorithm like a computer? So let's talk about algorithms. Computers follow an algorithm or program, which is like a cookbook recipe for performing a predefined task. So in fact, one could write a program, a syllogism algorithm, and in fact, I've written one myself, which would accept as input strings of bits, zeros and ones, that encode characters representing premises like all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. In other words, all of that can be encoded as a string of bits. And then it could parse these premises by identifying the key character strings like all, are, and is. And it could extract the following and preceding character strings, specifically men, mortal, Socrates, and man. And then it could apply the rules applicable to syllogisms to generate the new character string, Socrates is mortal, and it could display this on a screen. So it's basically just manipulating these strings of bits to come up with some new string of bits. So does that mean that a computer is capable of reasoning by use of an algorithm? And what about the brain? Is the brain just a computer made of neurons running a complex algorithm that's determined by our genetics and modified by learning through past experiences and memories? If someone's thoughts that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man are just patterns of firing of neurons within the brain that could be processed by some syllogism algorithm that we learned to generate another pattern of firing of neurons, another thought that says Socrates is mortal, then it would seem that the brain could reason by purely algorithmic means using laws of cause and effect operating within our neural networks. This particular theory that thoughts are only patterns of firing of neurons is called the computational representational theory of thought, or CRTT. So neural networks in the brain, being logically similar to artificial neural networks in an AI system, can indeed process data in an algorithmic fashion conditioned by learning in the neural networks. I think we have to grant that that's the case. But the big question is such algorithmic processing all that the human mind is doing? Does such algorithmic processing in neural networks involve any understanding of the meaning of the abstract concepts? The meaning of strings of data, that is, bits and bytes in a digital computer, is quite arbitrary. It's only defined by the use to which they're put. In other words, the meaning is assigned by the programmer who writes an algorithm for manipulating those strings of data. Any computational device will produce a specific output from specific input data based on its algorithm, that is, laws of cause and effect that occur in its circuits, regardless of any meaning attached to that input data. So a computer following an algorithm clearly does not understand what the string of bits it is processing means. So what about applying this to the brain? Edward Fieser notes the following. He's talking about this CRTT theory that we just mentioned. If a thought that Socrates is a man is identical with a neural process instantiating a sentence which has the meaning or content that Socrates is a man, then the meaning of the thought per se plays absolutely no role in causing whatever events the neural process, and thus the thought, causes. The causal properties of the neural process or thought would be just as they are, even if it instead had the meaning that it is raining, or even if it had no meaning at all. Thus, the fact that your thought has the meaning that Socrates is a man would play absolutely no role whatsoever in causing you, for example, to say or write the sentence that Socrates is mortal. The electrochemical properties of the neural process implementing the thought are all that matter to its causal efficacy. So what Fieser is basically saying is the algorithmic processing in a computing device or in neuronal networks of a brain after learning does not involve any understanding of meaning, but is fully determined by causal properties. And Fieser would conclude that this represents a major fault or problem with the CRTT theory of thoughts being just patterns of firing of neurons in our brain. Now, you might say, well, the brain is very complicated. It's got 86 billion neurons, and each of these neurons is making nearly 10,000 synaptic connections. So that's like 800 trillion synaptic connections, each with their own synaptic weight. And, all of this might be so complicated that maybe that does allow for human understanding and reasoning to occur. Maybe we just can't fathom what's going on in such a complicated device as the brain. Well, to answer that, let's talk about Turing machines. Mathematician Alan Turing invented a simplified digital machine called a Turing machine that can read or write one bit at a time on a moving tape. This Turing machine is basically a device for performing an algorithm, that is, a series of stored instructions or recipe for doing something. It uses its moving tape for storing binary digits, zeros and ones, as its input, output, and storage space for intermediate results. The Turing machine has a read-write unit that reads the next bit on the tape, and then its stored program or algorithm specifies what action the machine performs when it reads a 1, or what action it performs when it reads a 0. The possible actions are quite simple, like write a 0, write a 1, move right, move left, jump to a specified step in the algorithm, or stop, end the program. That's all it can do. The sequences of bits on the tape can encode either numbers or other information like letters and sentences and so on, using an appropriate code. Thus, a Turing machine can manipulate any digital information. And because it's an arbitrary device having any arbitrary algorithm, it could carry out any algorithm. That is, it can do anything that a modern electronic digital computer can do, except much more slowly. And yet it's simple enough to be definable as a mathematical object, and that's why Turing was interested in it. So this, by the way, is a picture of an actual Turing machine that somebody built. So why even think about a Turing machine? Well, it's because of this mathematical challenge posed by David Hilbert and Wilhelm Ackermann in 1928, which they called the decision-making problem. They posed this problem to the mathematical community to find an algorithm or computational procedure that can decide whether or not any mathematical proposition or theorem can be proved true from the axioms using the rules of logic. So basically they were saying, go find a comprehensive recipe for doing all mathematical proofs. So Turing, using his Turing machine as a mathematical definition of a machine following an algorithm, proved this famous theorem showing that one cannot find such an algorithm that's capable of deciding whether or not any possible mathematical proposition about arithmetic can be proved true or not. In other words, he proved that the decision-making problem has no solution. This theorem really applies to all computing devices that use a program or algorithm, since any such computer is logically equivalent to a Turing machine. Thus, any possible algorithm or computational procedure conducted by any device cannot determine the truth or falsehood of all possible mathematical propositions. Now, this is very interesting because that means that some propositions about arithmetic, although proven to be true by human mathematicians, are necessarily unprovable by any possible algorithm. Well, physicist Roger Penrose wrote a book about all of this, which this book here, if you want to see it, basically his book points out that a computer following an algorithm does not understand what is needed to prove a mathematical proposition, but can only carry out many calculations, no doubt very quickly, while a human mathematician relies on understanding of what is needed to invent a proof. This understanding must be non-computational or non-algorithmic, and therefore cannot be achieved by any computing device. So Penrose concludes that understanding is critical to reasoning. Human mathematical reasoning cannot be a cookbook or algorithmic process. It must be non-computable. Now, this has very interesting implications with regard to what the brain can and cannot do. Penrose argues that all physical systems, including the brain with its neural networks built out of integrate and fire neurons, can be simulated by a computer algorithm using the mathematical equations that describe the system, such as the Hodgkin-Huxley equations about ion channels and action potentials. Therefore, all physical systems obeying the mathematical laws of physics are computable and algorithmic. They can all be simulated on a computer. Now, Penrose didn't take the next step from that, but going beyond Penrose, I think we can conclude that since human mathematical reasoning must involve a process which is non-computable or non-algorithmic, such reasoning cannot be carried out by any physical system, such as the brain. Most likely, this is true of all human reasoning, whether mathematical or non-mathematical. Therefore, reasoning must depend upon a non-physical aspect of the human mind. Now, where does this get us? Regarding free will, understanding, and reasoning, to summarize, we already said that human behavior, when freely choosing one's actions, that is, free will, cannot originate in a merely material system such as the brain. And now we've also said that human behavior, when reasoning and understanding, cannot originate in a merely material system such as the brain. So the brain may, in a certain sense, be a computer, but the human mind somehow gets beyond that computing, that mere computing. Now let's apply this to artificial intelligence systems. AI systems will always merely emulate some human cognitive abilities while never being able to manifest true abstract understanding, reasoning to ascertain truth, and freedom of choice, despite any future advances in computer processor speed and memory storage, including quantum computing, which is still algorithmic-based, or any future developments in software and training algorithms for artificial neural networks. And this is because information processing done by any material or physical system which follows the laws of physics, and we do believe that all material systems follow the laws of physics, will always be algorithmic and deterministic or computable, and therefore cannot lead to abstract understanding, reasoning, and free will, period. So where does that leave us with regard to human understanding? Well, I think it leads us to the soul. If humans have a non-physical aspect, a soul or spirit, then it would be possible to explain some aspects of our minds, our conscious subjective experiences during life, including abstract understanding, abstract reasoning, and free will, as arising from an immaterial soul and not solely arising from physical processes going on in the brain. However, postulating a soul which exists separately from the body, which is called dualism, does lead to a major dilemma. How does the soul influence the brain, and how is it influenced by the brain? In particular, it is clear that all human behavior is related to brain function, but there's no known mechanism by which an immaterial soul may influence or interact with physical processes going on in the brain. So we have a problem. There's a gap here between soul and brain, and we have to somehow bridge that gap. So let's work toward bridging that gap. And I think the way to solve this dilemma of dualism is through assuming a functional unification of soul and brain. In other words, I believe it's necessary to assume that the human soul and brain must collaborate or function synergistically as a unified whole. This follows from these facts. People with brain damage, particularly in the prefrontal regions due to trauma, strokes, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, and other neurologic diseases, often have impaired memory retrieval, reasoning, and decision-making. So that's kind of indirect evidence that these brain areas are involved in these processes. Also, neurophysiologic studies like recording the electroencephalogram or the magnetoencephalogram and functional MRI studies, which look at brain blood flow, on awake humans demonstrate involvement of prefrontal and other brain regions during tasks that involve working memory and recall, reasoning, and decision-making. But at the same time, we also just proved that the brain as a physical entity subject to physical laws by itself, that is, without help from a spiritual soul, cannot be a substrate for free will and abstract understanding and reasoning to ascertain truth. So that's why I conclude that they must function synergistically or collaborate in all aspects of thinking and remembering and reasoning and decision-making and deciding. So here's a reasonable hypothesis of soul-brain collaboration, which I feel is in line with what the Catholic Church teaches about human nature. By God's design of the human being as a union of matter and spirit forming a single nature, which we call human nature, throughout life, the understanding, abstract reasoning, and decision-making actions of the soul can in fact depend upon the brain for recalling memories, sensory perception, basic cognitive tasks, and basic cognitive information processing, while the soul, in its turn, intrinsically affects the information processing going on in the brain, including the processes of decision-making and reasoning that are taking place in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So that means that the brain by itself might be a computer, but the brain never is by itself. It's always linked to the soul, and therefore it goes beyond what a computer alone can do. Thus, during life, the soul and brain collaborate in all aspects of cognition, while after the death of the body, human consciousness continues via the immortal soul. But the big question is, how does this collaboration happen? And the answer I'm going to propose is through quantum effects in the brain. So let's talk about that. Why invoke quantum mechanics? Well, the reason is that the only known instance in which the deterministic laws of cause and effect in the physical world seemingly break down is in the so-called R process of quantum mechanics, or state vector collapse. And I talked about this in detail in my last webinar last December, and other people this year have talked about it also. So I can't go into the details, but basically the idea of quantum mechanics is that the equations of quantum mechanics predict the probabilities of various possible outcomes of a quantum process. But eventually, at the time of the R process, one actual outcome is apparently chosen at random from many superimposed possible outcomes. So this leads to the idea that maybe the soul gives a person the ability to choose one particular outcome of state vector collapse from all of the possible outcomes that might occur in quantum processes in the brain. And if that were so, then that would be a potential mechanism by which an immaterial soul could affect the brain without violating any of the laws of physics, since all of this choice of possible outcomes in the R process kind of goes beyond the laws of physics. However, this idea does lead to several difficult to answer questions. So let's talk about those questions one by one. First, what are the quantum processes in the brain whose outcomes may potentially be influenced by the soul? Second, can selecting one specific outcome of state vector collapse in quantum processes in the brain be sufficient to affect human decision-making and reasoning going on in the frontal cortex of the brain? Since quantum effects are very small fluctuations, can they really change the firing behavior of neurons and the behavior of neural networks? Third question, what gives the soul the ability to analyze the quantum superpositions pertaining to the physical constituents of the brain and select the outcomes of myriads of quantum processes in a large number of relevant neurons in order to select the appropriate outcome of state vector collapse to bring about the chosen behavior? In other words, to get the neurons to fire in just the right way that the appropriate neural network behavior will occur to cause the right muscles to be activated and bring about the chosen behavior. So those are the three questions we're going to tackle. And in order to tackle these, we're going to have to go back to ion channels and action potentials. So these are our friends, the voltage-gated sodium channel and the voltage-gated potassium channel that we talked about earlier. Now, the crystallographic structure of these channels has been worked out, and this shows the voltage-gated potassium channel structure. This is a side view of the channel showing all the different strings of amino acids in the various proteins that make up that channel. This is the outside of the cell. This is the inside of the cell. This is a top view of that same structure. And you see in the middle of the, looking down from the top here, in the middle there's this channel or pore, and ions can pass through that from the outside to the inside of the cell or vice versa. This is a magnified view of the narrow channel filter region. In this region here, the space is only such that ions can pass through in single file, interspersed with water molecules. So we have a potassium ion, water molecule, potassium ion, water molecule, and so on. And they have to pass through this string of amino acids, which are threonine amino acids that have these negatively charged carboxyl groups. These amino acids are called S1, S2, S3, and S4. And the question is, given the strong electrical forces on these potassium ions exerted by the negative carboxyl groups of the threonine amino acids in this channel filter region, how do the potassium ions efficiently pass through that narrow channel, going from S4 to S1? And the answer is they do so through quantum effects. This has been worked out by these authors here who solved the Schrödinger equation of quantum mechanics for a potassium ion passing through this well-known structure determined by X-ray crystallography. And what they found is that the potassium ion going through here becomes delocalized. So this little white band represents the probability for finding the potassium ion in a particular location. And this potassium ion is moving here from left to right. So over time, it becomes kind of delocalized. There's a certain probability of finding it way out here, although the main probability is that the potassium ion is here. And then still later in time, the main probability of finding the potassium ion is here, but there's some probability that it's actually back here. And there's even some probability that it's way, way out here, already having left the channel, as it were. So the potassium ion wave function becomes more delocalized as it moves along from S1 to S0. Same thing happens as it moves from S4 to S3 and so on. So these same authors later wrote a paper where they did a simulation of the transition of potassium ions from S4 to S3, both for a classical ensemble of ions having a Gaussian distribution of velocities around an average velocity of 900 meters per second, versus a single quantum wave packet having that same average velocity. So what we're plotting here is position within that channel S4 to S3. This is in nanometers versus time in picoseconds. For the classical ensemble, you see that this Gaussian distributed velocity of particles starts out all moving sort of in unison, but then at this point in time, it splits, and some of the potassium ions with the lower velocity presumably turn back and don't make it from S4 to S3. Others go through. So only about 50% of classical ions would make it through that transition. On the other hand, the quantum wave packet shows that the biggest probability, over 90% probability, is that the potassium ion will make it through from S4 to S3. There's only a low probability, less than 10%, that the potassium ion won't make it through. So that's shown again on this graph here, the probability to find the potassium ion in S3, given that it started in S4 as a function of time. The quantum mechanical wave packet makes it through almost entirely, whereas the classical ensemble, some of it gets diverted back and only 50% chance that it makes it through. Now, if you use even smaller velocities, like 300 meters per second, none of the classical ions will get through, but the quantum potassium ion does get through with a low probability. The authors also point out that there may be quantum phenomena like entanglement that occur between successive ions that may also affect these probabilities of getting through an open ion channel. So my proposed answer to question 1, what quantum processes may be potentially influenced by the soul, is passage of ions through ion channels. After all, there are 20 quadrillion of these ion channels in the brain, and they all have these similar structure with the ions passing through a narrow channel. So it seems like that might be a point where these quantum mechanical effects might well occur. Let's move on to the second question. In order to answer the second question, are these quantum effects or quantum fluctuations large enough to really affect the firing of neurons and the behavior of a neuronal network? In order to answer that, we're going to have to look at what's called chaotic dynamics. Neuronal networks have been found to manifest chaotic behavior. That means that their dynamics is such that they're extremely sensitive to the initial conditions. So a very slight variability in the neuronal synaptic inputs of the network can be amplified by this chaotic behavior. Nevertheless, meaningful information processing must reliably take place in the neuronal networks despite this amplification of slight variability in the input states. Otherwise, cognitive processes would be subject to unacceptable variability in outcomes, causing maladaptive behaviors. Now, simulations of network behavior and the dynamics of these neural networks show that the type of chaos seen in the firing behavior of network neurons has low-dimensional input-specific chaotic attractors. A chaotic attractor is just a set of dynamical states toward which the network dynamics tends to evolve. So that means that reliable functional information processing occurring in the brain's networks depends on the fact that strongly chaotic networks, despite underlying fluctuations in neuronal synaptic inputs, can in fact produce patterns in the firing in their output that reliably encode the time-dependent input stimuli. So this has been worked out for specific cases, for example, recalling a memory. Storage of memories in neuronal networks doesn't take place by like some single neuron or set of neurons being the point at which that memory is stored. Rather, memories are distributed over huge networks involving billions of neurons all connected together. And the memory storage takes place, as it were, in the dynamics of that neural network. And it involves chaotic attraction. This includes both very short-term storage, working memory, as well as long-term storage that takes place due to the alteration of synaptic weights within that huge neuronal network. The network dynamics on these simulated networks, at least, shows multiple fixed point and chaotic attractors, each one of which is associated with a particular memory that has been stored in that neural network. So in response to the presentation of an external cue, even an incomplete or fragmentary cue to that network, for example, a specific sensory input like a sight or sound or smell, that was previously correlated with that stored memory, the network dynamics evolves to the specific attractor state associated with the original memory, and that effectively retrieves the entire memory that had been set down in the past. A similar thing occurs with rapid decision-making. There's a model that's been used by psychologists for many years called the drift diffusion model that explains how we make rapid decisions. The idea is that the integration of gradually accumulating sensory or other information leads to a response by a random walk process that's occurring at a drift rate that determines the reaction time, how long it takes for us to respond to that sensory stimulus. And this may occur because the network dynamics of the neural network involved in making this decision manifest two chaotic attractors, one associated with the so-called correct response, the other with the so-called incorrect response. An accumulation of information, even quite incomplete sensory information, like when we're peering out into the dark at night, for example, eventually causes evolution of the network dynamics to either of these two attractors biased toward the correct response network state. So again, even given incomplete sensory or input information, the neural network eventually converges upon one attractor or the other, thereby determining the behavior. So, are quantum fluctuations enough to influence the outcomes of these computations occurring in these huge neural networks? Well, in complex chaotic networks having more than one chaotic attractor, the system dynamics may shift from one attractor to another if the network is perturbed sufficiently. And the degree of perturbation can be quite small because it is chaotic behavior and very sensitive to the initial conditions or the sensory input in this case. So small correlated quantum fluctuations occurring in multiple ion channels within the network's neurons with an additive effect leading to small correlated increases or decreases in ion fluxes, which would be a relatively improbable occurrence looking at it as a random event, would cause the network dynamics to converge upon a different final state or attractor, thus retrieving a different memory or establishing a different behavior or choice of behavior from what would have occurred without these correlated quantum fluctuations. So, for example, in this well-studied mathematical system, Newton-Lipnic system, this shows two chaotic attractors, and the trajectories that connect one attractor to the other in the phase space. So my answer to this second difficult question, can selecting one specific outcome of state vector collapse be sufficient to affect human decision-making and reasoning? I would say yes, small correlated quantum fluctuations occurring in multiple channels within multiple neurons with additive effect on the net ion fluxes would indeed cause the dynamics of a neural network with chaotic behavior to converge upon a different final state or attractor, thus retrieving a different memory or deciding upon a different behavior or choice. All right, then the final difficult question. Let's talk about God, soul, and brain collaboration via quantum effects. Physicist Wolfgang Smith postulates that the outcome of state vector collapse in all quantum processes in the universe is not, in fact, entirely random, as conventional physics would say, but rather it's God who chooses the particular outcome. Smith calls this action of God vertical causation. If that's so, then God must choose the particular outcomes of the quantum processes determining ion movements through ion channels in neurons. By choosing a relatively low probability outcome of small correlated quantum fluctuations in the ion fluxes occurring simultaneously in myriads of channels within a neuronal network, God can change the outcome of a computational process in that network, thereby retrieving a different memory or enacting a different choice of behavior by moving the network dynamical state away from one chaotic attractor and toward another. By causing such a set of correlated quantum fluctuations, God influences the outcome of human thinking and decision-making. In this way, God enables and facilitates many human cognitive functions, including perception of universal forms, understanding abstract concepts, abstract reasoning, like the determination of mathematical truth, and decision-making, while at the same time, he always preserves human free will. So this may be what we call divine inspiration. To summarize then, God permits all created things to act as secondary causes by so-called horizontal causation, the laws of cause and effect in physical systems, that is, the laws of physics. But free will and reasoning abstractly is possible because God allows the human soul alone among created things to participate in vertical causation, which is usually God's prerogative, but only in respect to the brain's neuronal ion channels. That is, he doesn't allow us to have effects on physical systems other than our own brain. So only God, not a human soul, has a complete knowledge of the physical systems of the brain and the structure of uncollapsed quantum superpositions in state vectors describing ion movements. Thus, only God has the complete knowledge needed to ensure that the outcome of state vector collapse in the myriads of ion channels in the brain's neurons ultimately produces the outcome in our brains and bodies that our soul chooses. So my answer to the third difficult question, what gives the soul the ability to analyze quantum superpositions of the physical constituents of the brain, etc., is God does this, not the unaided human soul. So God facilitates our soul collaborating with our brain. So let's go into the nitty-gritty details of how this might work. A well-known attentional mechanism in the brain temporarily binds together the firing of a particular set of relevant neurons involved in memory recall, sensory perception, or other cognitive tasks that are currently in process by synchronizing their spikes in a 40 to 70 hertz oscillation that originates with a pacemaker in the thalamus. This synchronization is called working awareness, and this determines the moment-to-moment content of our consciousness, that is, what sensory information or what memories we are thinking about or concentrating on at any specific time. Whereas the brain encodes the moment-to-moment content of consciousness in a physical way as a specific pattern of firing of neurons. Remember the CRTT theory. The soul, which is linked to the brain, simultaneously experiences, interprets, and further processes, and thereby perceives, understands, and reasons about the same moment-to-moment content of consciousness in an intellectual fashion. Thus, human conscious experience depends on the soul for non-algorithmic and non-deterministic higher level or human mental abilities as much as on brain neurophysiology for algorithmic lower level or animal-like mental abilities. So this theory, I think, accounts the best for the facts we talked about before, that clearly the brain is involved in all cognitive processes, and yet the brain can't do it alone, yet it can do it when linked to a soul through God's mediation. So this is the idea then, what I call the soul-brain interface loop, with the content of consciousness being interchanged between soul and brain at a frequency of 40 to 70 hertz. The soul provides the higher-level mental abilities like human self-apprehension and self-consciousness, understanding, reasoning, ascertaining truth, goodness, and beauty, and human-level decision-making, free will. Through God's mediation, the soul affects state vector collapse in ion channels in neurons, the integration of synaptic inputs and individual neuron firing, and then deterministic algorithmic processing going on in neural networks. And the brain provides basic consciousness or awareness of environment, in other words, focusing attention on particular things in our sensory stream or our memories or whatever. It provides sensory perception, memory, basic cognitive functions, and reflexive decision-making, which is deterministic. So all the kind of things that an animal brain can do is also occurring in our brain, but the soul supplements that, basically. All right, so that's the theory I'm proposing. To end up in the last 5-10 minutes here, I'd like to talk about the interesting idea of making moral decisions and conscience and God's grace, since after all, it's moral decision-making that determines our eternal destiny of heaven or hell. So, moral decision-making and the brain. Neuroscientists distinguish pre-decision-making neural networks and decision-making neural networks. Since the soul relies upon the brain's working awareness, according to what we just talked about, God must first influence the neuronal networks of the brain in order to prime the soul to make a choice by influencing the outcome of state vector collapse in neuronal ion channels in brain systems involved in pre-decision making. And what are these brain systems? Well, there's two sets of them. The working awareness systems include the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the inferior parietal cortex. These systems bring into our consciousness memories of past experiences that would relate to the feasibility and likely outcomes of various behavioral choices. And in terms of moral decision-making, that would include bringing to our mind memorized scripture passages or admonitions by authority figures, in other words, moral teachings, and our previous resolutions and intentions regarding behavior. This is called the rational decision-making process occurring in these brain areas. At the same time, the affective systems of the brain, like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex and other limbic system structures, convey the emotional content of memories, like memories of rewards and punishments. In other words, how did you feel when you did that and that happened as a result? That kind of emotional content, and the risks and benefits of various behaviors. This is called the emotional decision-making process. So these two processes go on in parallel in the brain, and God must be influencing these processes in order to prime our soul to make the choice that he wants us to make. These, by the way, are the brain areas that we're talking about. The lateral surface of the brain is these rational decision-making areas, whereas the medial surface of the brain that's between the two hemispheres is the emotional decision-making areas, so-called limbic system. This comes from an interesting article called Neuromorality. All right, so how does this all relate to conscience? Conscience involves God's influence on human moral decisions. Because of this idea of brain-soul collaboration, the soul's reasoning and decision-making actions must be synergistic with the information processing going on in these decision-making areas of the brain. This brain-soul collaboration requires the influence of God upon both the brain and the soul. God influences our thoughts and moral decisions both by bringing about physical changes in our brains and engaging our spiritual souls. So God must first influence the neuronal networks of the brain to prepare to make a choice prior to the actual behavioral choice being made. One's conscience must, of course, depend to a significant degree on what moral teachings and past experiences are stored in the brain, that is, our memories. These teachings form our conscience. What about grace? Well, Thomas Aquinas distinguishes two types of actual grace. Actual grace, if you're wondering, is the kind of grace that God gives us when we're making a moral decision. And he distinguishes sufficient grace and efficacious grace, but these terms refer to the ultimate effects of the grace. Aquinas says that all human beings are given actual grace that's sufficient for them to choose righteous acts, especially due to a conscience that prompts someone to act righteously and thus ultimately be saved. So nobody can complain, well, I didn't have a reasonable chance of doing righteous things. Everybody gets this sufficient grace to have a reasonable chance of doing righteous acts. But specifically in individual moral decisions, sometimes God gives grace which is efficacious, that is, it invariably causes a righteous act to be done, while other times he gives sufficient grace in the sense of merely sufficient but not efficacious, that is, grace that potentially could have caused a righteous act but did not because of human resistance to the grace. So that's the way Thomas Aquinas looks at moral decision-making. So he distinguishes two effects or stages that are present when efficacious grace is granted, which are called operating grace and cooperating grace. Operating grace, stage one, means that God first moves a person's mind to desire the good. This interior influence on the will, Aquinas says, is entirely the work of God. So it doesn't come from our soul or from within us. It comes from outside of us. The second stage, cooperating grace, means that God then causes a person to freely act to bring about the good that God wills. That's stage two. According to Thomas Aquinas, because God assists us in this act, both by strengthening our will interiorly so as to attain to the act, and by granting outwardly the capability of operating, it is with respect to this that we speak of cooperating grace. So Thomas Aquinas' teaching that God first imparts operating grace that's sufficient to move the mind to will a righteous act, that I feel is kind of comparable to the pre-decision making that's going on in the frontal lobe neuronal networks, that is setting the stage for making a moral decision by calling to mind previous resolutions, memorized scripture passages, etc. In some situations, like in severe dementia, head trauma, or other brain diseases, or with psychosis, compulsions, or long-standing addictions, it may be very difficult for God to elicit the appropriate response in the pre-decision-making brain systems to prime the soul to freely choose to avoid sin and act righteously. That is, unless God first cures the neurological or psychological impediment. In such situations of severe neurological or mental illness, the person would not be considered responsible for their acts, even though the acts are objectively sinful. It's like the old legal determination, not guilty by virtue of insanity. For grace to be efficacious, in addition to God influencing pre-decision making in the brain, which is the operating grace, God must next influence state vector collapse in the neuronal ion channels in such a way that the appropriate decision-making neural networks converge upon a choice and send their output to our actual muscles to cause us to do something, resulting in performance of a righteous act. This stage is comparable to Thomas Aquinas' teaching that God bestows cooperating grace when he efficaciously moves the will to perform a righteous act. However, says Thomas Aquinas, God will not grant cooperating grace if the soul resists God's grace. Rather, given such resistance, he withholds this grace and permits the person to sin, because God always preserves human free will. Thus, God must give more grace to enable one to perform a righteous act. But he does give some grace to everyone making a moral decision. That's sufficient grace. All right. So that's how I think moral decision-making might relate to grace as well as to the neuronal networks of the brain. So let's finish up with one more slide here. This slide is a continuation of what I presented at my talk last December about how God's will is carried out in the universe as a whole. God's will determines the laws of nature, the laws of quantum mechanics, and the initial conditions of the universe. This, through what is called horizontal causation, determines the probabilities of the outcomes of all the different quantum events occurring in the universe. But then, God's will also determines the particular choice when the state vector collapses, the R process. So, in this sense, in the physical world, what happens is determined by God. However, in the human brain, it gets a little more complicated. God's will here leads to the collapse of state vectors governing ion movements in the neural networks in pre-decision-making brain systems. But the human free will, the soul, can accept or reject God's further grace. And if we accept the further grace, that leads to the God causing collapse of state vectors governing ion movements in the neural networks in decision-making brain systems, which actually causes certain muscles to contract so that we do certain things, thus performing the righteous act that God wills that we do. So St. Augustine says, nothing is done unless the Almighty wills it to be done, either by permitting it or by actually doing it. And Thomas Aquinas says, the will of God must needs always be fulfilled. Thus, it is clear that whatever God simply wills takes place, although what he wills antecedently may not take place. Well, does all of this sound pretty wild? Well, this is what G.K. Chesterton says in his poem. This world is wild as an old wives' tale, and strange the plain things are. The earth is enough, and the air is enough for our wonder and our war. And I'll end up with Psalm 139. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am wondrously made. Wonderful are your works. Well, I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lagerlund, for your presentation. And now we will entertain questions from our participants. Our Q&A moderator, Sheila Roth, is ITEST Administrative Assistant and Board Member. So Sheila, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, everyone, for your presentations. Our first question is from Father Brian John Zulke. He says, are either of you aware of anyone who has looked at the erroneous human tendency to anthropomorphize natural and artificial objects and attempted to make a critique against viewing AI as personal from this? The argument would go like this. We have a universal, erroneous cognitive tendency toward X. Viewing AI as a person is a case of X, QED. The logic is not Loctite, but it could contribute a suspicious line of reasoning that undermines the reasonability of viewing AI as personal. So that's to either of you.
Yeah, I sort of alluded to the same idea in my talk, I think, briefly, right? That when I mentioned the ELISA program in 1964 as an example of our tendency to anthropomorphize things based on pretty fragmentary evidence, actually. And I don't know that I've seen anyone else write about that in print yet. I've had conversations with other philosophers where I think we agree that this is a real issue. I think it's a potentially a frightening thing, actually, that we might get to the point where people think these AI systems really are people simply on the basis of their ability to emulate human behavior so well.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a real danger. And if I might hypothesize from the standpoint of a neurologist or from neurophysiology, the brain is very good at filling in missing information. I kind of alluded to the fact that very fragmentary sensory information can still lead to making a decision or retrieving a memory. And in neurologic circles, this is referred to as confabulation, when the brain fills in information that's actually incorrect and comes up with a decision or a thought that is incorrect, such as the thought that I'm talking to a person when I'm really talking to a chatbot, a computer program. So I think it might happen along those lines, and it is something to worry about. I think it can be dangerous, particularly to our teenagers who can easily get online and talk to chatbots and not know who they're talking to. I don't know what the solution to that is, but it is a real worry. By the way, AI systems also confabulate. That's well known, and they can make up false information.
May I just really quick make a follow-up comment? Yeah. So there was a paper that I recently encountered that was basically arguing from the standpoint of user interface design, we have to be very careful about what we do, because studies have actually shown that the more natural is the interaction with a user interface of a machine, almost like a person, like vocal stuff or whatever, the more tendency there is for people to make mistakes in terms of interpreting what is happening with the system that they're dealing with. So like we have empirical evidence that this sort of thing is actually like dangerous for people operating machines. So just wanted to throw that out there. I can send the paper if you'd like later.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that. Yeah. No, as you say about teenagers, it really worries me that they will start replacing real relationships with virtual relationships with the sort of ideal boyfriend or girlfriend that says exactly what they want to hear, essentially.
All right, great. Thank you. We have a question from Chris Riley. He says, it seems that pardon me? Okay. It seems that the emphasis on consciousness often has to do with AI developers' eagerness to present AI agents as human equivalents by focusing on a characteristic they seem to emulate. From an evangelization perspective, would it help to reject the consciousness emphasis and instead focus on other characteristics of organisms and especially human nature, such as unity of principle, essence, communication and love, and the will's drive to inquiry about truth, etc.?
Yeah, I agree with that. Actually, I think in my own approach to this, I certainly include consciousness as a problem, But the idea that it's the only problem for materialism, and that it's the thing that distinguishes persons from non-persons, I think that's a mistake. And these other aspects that Chris is referring to, I think, are all important. And I think Dr. Lagerlund made similar points too about the nature of human reasoning and conscious and rational thought.
Yeah, and I think that consciousness is difficult to define. A certain level of consciousness, that is, having an awareness of the environment and an ability to focus in on certain sensory stimuli, is present in animals and probably comes about through that same mechanism I was talking about of synchronizing the firing of multiple neurons in the 40 to 70 hertz oscillation when we concentrate upon something. I think my dog and my cat can do that too, but their consciousness is limited to their sensory stream. They can't project themselves into the past or project themselves into the future. They don't have a true awareness of self as self. I think those things only come about in humans because of the soul.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Dr. Bob Kurland. It's for either of you. There are instances of persons with almost empty brains that have consciousness and intelligence. Can these instances be used as arguments against a materialist explanation of consciousness?
Yeah, I think maybe he's talking about what Father Spitzer is often referred to, these patients with severe hydrocephalus that have mostly water in their heads, and the brain itself is reduced to a very thin layer. So, I think that what Father Spitzer has said is that many of these patients, or at least a subset of these patients, maybe not a majority, but a subset of these patients, can show significant intelligence that you could hardly expect from the tiny amount of brain tissue that's actually present in their heads. I don't know for sure what the explanation of that is, but I would guess that they have enough brain tissue that they can carry on some of these brain activities that are necessary to maintain awareness of the environment and to receive sensory stimuli and so on. But the soul is providing a greater effect in these people than it is perhaps. It's the soul and the brain are still collaborating, but in these particular people, the soul might be providing a lot more and the brain a lot less. So that might be one guess as to how to explain that phenomenon, which is well established.
Right. I think you'd agree that even in these cases, the brain plays an essential role, at least in this life, for thought.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas said very definitively, I am not my soul. Mm-hmm. Soul is not me. We are composite creatures, and soul and body must work together. For example, St. Thomas says very clearly that sensation is not something that pertains to the soul per se. It's something that pertains to the body. And I would agree with that.
Or the whole organism, strictly speaking. It's
right.
The whole person that perceives by the soul through the body, but not either the soul or the body itself.
Right. It requires the body, not just the soul. The soul can't by itself perceive sensations, is what he's saying. And I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, good. Father Aaron Nord asked the question, God uses fragments of substances for the material precursors of new thinking substances. How about a humble Turing test? If we can't distinguish an AI from a human being, we had better treat it well because God has done surprising things before.
I see. Right. So, that's a good question, actually. So how do I know? I mean, how do I know that, I don't know, the bottle on the table here isn't a person, right? God could miraculously make the bottle conscious and give it free will and so on. I just don't find that plausible, right? I don't think that's the way God works. He works in a much more orderly sort of fashion, and in a way that I think preserves the distinction between creatures, living creatures on the one hand, and anything a human being could assemble as an artifact.
And I would say that probably the Turing test, although it may be very difficult to find a difference, the Turing test will eventually be failed by AI systems if you test them thoroughly enough. That an expert in a particular area testing that AI system will be able to determine that it's an AI system and not a person or something like that. That's my guess. Of course, I don't have proof of it in terms of empirical proof, but I think the argument I gave would say that that's the case because the AI system doesn't have true understanding. It doesn't have true free will, and it doesn't have true self-consciousness either.
Right.
I mean, it might in practice be really difficult to tell, though. I think that's the thing we have to admit.
Right. It could be very difficult, and that's why AI is dangerous, not because it will ever have free will and the ability to understand and reason like a human, but rather because it can emulate it so closely that it will fool many people. That's the danger, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a rather lengthy question from David Miskell. What are the spiritual or moral implications of projecting consciousness on AI assistants in 5 or 10 years? Will God be replaced with our AI assistant? Will truth and reality be interpreted for us by our AI assistant? Will we lose our free will and become dependent on our AI assistant? In 5 to 10 years, AI assistants could be with us all the time, even more than our cell phone today. I would compare our AI assistants to a guardian angel, always watching over us, always listening and watching, even when we sleep. They will be able to engage in conversations about health, daily life, and even complex emotions that feel deeply personal and meaningful. Will people treat their AI assistant as a moral being, forming attachments and even relying on it emotionally? Our relationship with non-perfect humans will be affected by our perfect AI assistant. Our projection of consciousness could cause people to consider their AI assistant their best friend, their significant other, or other spiritual leader. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I totally agree. I agree these are really dangerous things, especially with all the hype that we're getting with AI recently about the singularity and that the AI systems will be smarter than we are. There'll be some sort of superior intelligent beings. That could create this really dangerous deference to these systems. And that could also, I worry that it could lead to a kind of very sophisticated totalitarianism, basically, where the people who are constructing these AI systems have built them in such a way to sustain their own, create and sustain their own power.
Yeah, and the AI systems do ultimately reflect the programming put into them by their makers.
Yeah.
I think that it's similar to the last question. It is definitely a major danger that those things will happen. And as far as replacing God, well, I think already functionally, as it were, cell phones and many other things have replaced God in our culture. So it's no doubt that AI will also replace God in many people's minds, unfortunately. And I think we as Christians have to try to combat that tendency.
Absolutely.
Okay. Another question from Gibbonsburg. He says, relatedly, can an AI machine be manipulated by preternatural creatures and function as a sort of very efficient and high bandwidth Ouija board? If so, are there rules for discernment of spirits, like St. Ignatius of Loyola taught in his spiritual exercises, for determining the nature and goodwill of the mind one is communicating with? How may we test the spirits to assess the soul of a new mind machine?
Yeah, it's an interesting and frightening thought. It reminds me of Lewis's That Hideous Strength, his novel about Nice, where they resurrect, in the sense, a human brain and think of it as some kind of super intelligent system, and in fact, it's being manipulated by demons in the story. Since I believe in supernatural agencies of that kind, and I wouldn't put it past them to take advantage of opportunities like this to speak to us. And so, yeah, spiritual discernment seems to be essential.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to say whether that could happen. I think that the fallen angels are much more likely to influence human minds than they are AI systems, however, because we do have a spiritual aspect that they can somehow influence or communicate with. I don't know how much power the demons have in the physical world to bring about things in the physical world, but it would seem like if they're going to have power at all in the physical world, then they could influence AI systems just like they could influence anything else. But it's a difficult question.
Right. Dr. Tom Sheehan asks the question, what is the reality of software? When a computer is shut off, the software still exists.
Yeah, I think software is an intellectual construct. And so it bears some resemblance to the soul in that certain sense, but you can't take that resemblance too far by any means.
Yeah.
Software, after all, is algorithmic, and I've spent this whole time talking about how the soul isn't algorithmic. But there is a certain resemblance that the software by itself could sit around on the shelf as simply a mathematical or logical construct and not do anything. Only when it's actually running on a hardware on the computer does it do anything. And to a certain degree, the soul is like that. But the soul also, according to Thomas Aquinas, has subsistence. That is, it does exist per se because it has an operation per se, namely the ability to reason and understand and choose and all of that type of thing. So in that sense, it's not like software also. I don't know if that answers the question.
I mean, you find this idea that the mind, the soul, is this software running on wetware. The brain is the hardware, and the soul, and that's a deeply confused idea, wrong-headed idea, I think, for some of the reasons that you just suggested. As you say, the meaning of any piece of software is highly conventional and extrinsic. We assign the meaning to its inputs and outputs, and to its algorithms and so on. There's no intrinsic meaning there, as there is in the case of an actual human soul or human mind. And in another respect, you might think this piece of software is just a sort of abstract object, like like pie or something, right? It's not a concrete reality at all. It could be the very same software could be running in many different places at different times. But a human mind can't be multiply located in that same way, I don't think.
Yeah, good point.
All right, very good. We have a question from Father Brian John Zulke. He says, Roger Penrose agrees with the quantum mechanics explanation of human cognition. I missed some of the details of Dr. Lagerlund's presentation, but he did mention Penrose at one point. Could he comment more about Penrose's thesis that human cognition is a quantum mechanical trick?
Yeah, I can certainly comment more about that. I spent a lot of time in my book talking about that. I didn't have time to talk about it in today's presentation, but Penrose came up with an idea along with an anesthesiologist by the name of Hameroff that microtubules are structures inside of all cells, including neurons, that these microtubules might undergo some kind of quantum computations. In other words, they exist in a superposition of states and work like a quantum computer, and that may be the mechanism of human consciousness. So at the basic level, Penrose was putting forth a materialistic theory of consciousness, trying to say that something's going on in the brain, in the physical brain, that can explain all of these aspects of human consciousness that we know about. And in order to get around the Turing theorem, which I talked about and which Penrose talks about in great detail, Penrose postulates that somehow in these microtubules, there's something going on which obeys some new law of physics that hasn't yet been discovered, which is non-computational, because all the laws of physics so far discovered are computational and therefore algorithmic, Penrose says. But there must be, says Penrose, some new law of physics that hasn't yet been discovered by physicists, which is non-computational, and that must be what's going on in these brain structures in order to lead to understanding and reasoning and so on. So it's an interesting idea, but what exactly would be a law of physics that's non-computational is the question. In other words, it would be a law of physics that's not expressible as an equation that you can't simulate on a computer. It would seem to me that if there were such a law, it would be not just a non-computational law, but a useless law, because you couldn't get any predictions out of it. And all laws of nature, we like to get predictions out of. But going beyond that, the whole idea that there's a law at all is meaning a cause and effect relationship. And that's just won't explain reasoning and free will. I mean, as physicist Stephen Barr says, all the laws of physics are quantitative, and they either show deterministic or random behavior. That's the only thing a quantitative analysis can show. But free will is a tertium quid, a third thing, and it can't come about through any law of physics. So I don't think just saying that there's a new law of physics that hasn't been discovered is going to get anywhere in this. There's the fact that anything is determined by law at all means that it's not going to be able to think or reason. It's not like we're ever going to discover that one proton says to the other proton, well, let me think about this. Today, I know I normally repel you, but today I think the best thing to do would be to attract you instead. That just doesn't go on in natural systems. Everything is determined by law in the physical world. So I don't think Penrose's theory in the end is going to work.
I agree. I mean, I think the problem is he doesn't really mean anything by either law or physics. Those are both just terms in that context that are meaningless.
Yeah, I mean, he has his idea, I suppose, of what laws of physics might be that are non-computational, but I don't think the concept really makes sense.
No, I agree.
All right. Thank you so much for answering the questions, and thank you for everybody for participating in our Q&A. I'm going to turn it back over to Sebastian now for our closing.
All right. Well, thank you so very much, Sheila, for leading the Q&A, and thank you everyone for your participation in this webinar. Thank you especially to Dr. Robert Koons and Dr. Terrence Lagerlund for your excellent presentations. Thank you as well to Deacon David Miskell and Sister Mary Beth Ryson for leading us in prayer. In conclusion, our closing prayer will be led by Sister Mary Beth Ryson, School Sister of Notre Dame. Sister Mary Beth has ministered as a science educator on both the elementary and secondary school levels. She received her PhD in International Relations from Tufts University's Fletcher School, where her research focus was on arms control verification. As an adjunct professor, she designed and taught international relations courses. Currently, she is a member of the Peace Economy Project Board of Directors. Sister Mary Beth, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you all. We thank our presenters very, very specially. And now we will begin with and end with our prayer, but our prayer will lead us to follow what we have learned today. So let us now reflect in prayer. Loving God, you have come to us today in a very special way, reminding us who we are, that we are conscious beings with our reasoning powers. And all that we have learned will help us understand more what is before us in modernity with the coming of what we say is artificial intelligence. Let us see that this AI is really not a total solution, a total power, but that it is you who have allowed this new development in our humanity, our world. So help us to live this development, accept it, and be careful about using it, and only to your honor and glory, and not for the destructive purposes that may develop. So we ask you, God, loving God, Creator, Redeemer, Sanctifying Spirit, help us on this journey that we can always be with you and for you and love you continually, we pray. Amen.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.